had in terms of things like AA corporates, but it was pretty dramatic in terms of triple Bs and double Bs. Double Bs are, by the way, the best grade of junk bond, if that makes any sense to you. And take a look at what's happened over the last year. The spreads in those bonds have moved to levels we have never seen before. So we've had two anomalies. We went from extraordinarily low volatility to extraordinarily high volatility in the equity market. And in the bond market, we went from extremely narrow bond yields to unprecedentedly wide bond yields. These yields, by the way, imply that the default rate will increase 4 times. Now, we think there will be problems in some corporate debt, but will the default rate increase 4 times on average? Probably not. And so one of our conclusions is that in the equity market, we think that value has been restored. Value is not a timing device, of course. And we think in the bond markets, we have seen a restoration of value as well. By the way, this chart shows you only the corporate bonds. We were much more concerned about those narrowing spreads in the mortgage markets than we were in corporates. And of course, you know how that has worked. We also know that right now, with that very wide, significant movement in spreads, there is another market that has changed dramatically, and that, of course, the municipal bond market. We have a situation in many communities around the United States where tax-exempt securities, which normally sell at yields dramatically below treasuries, are now selling at yields above treasuries, even before you take into consideration the tax aspects. There could be some opportunities there. And one final one is the TIPS. These are treasury securities that are issued to provide some inflation protection. They are priced as if deflation, which we think we'll see over the next few months, will persist for the next 5 to 10 years. We don't think so. And so if you want to think about what happens 2, 3, 4 years from now, when we think there's a good chance inflation moves higher, these securities are pricing in a different sort of scenario and represent opportunity. They represent opportunity on a longer-term basis. Now, I indicated at the outset that I had a challenge, and that was to get through all of my material within the allocated time. I am failing. And so I am going to skip ahead a few slides because I'd like to focus in on one last topic, and that is government policy. Government policy clearly takes several forms. There are 2 to discuss, one being monetary policy. The Federal Reserve controls or attempts to control not just interest rates, but more importantly, availability of funds, liquidity. And if you remember your Economics 102, you may recall money supply. And what I'm showing you here is M2. Normally, M2 is the stuff that fuels the pace of economic activity in the United States. And I think that you'll see that we got stuck at a level during most of 2008, and then all of a sudden it took off. And the period at which it began to take off, not surprisingly, was the end of September 2008, when the Federal Reserve, in concert with Treasury, took a look at financial markets that stopped working. And the decision was made, we believe appropriately, to provide liquidity, not just through lower interest rates, but by opening the borrowing windows and by allowing financial institutions and others to basically exchange fixed income securities on their balance sheet for high-level, high-grade treasuries on the Federal Reserve's balance sheet. As a consequence, you can see that M2, which is critical for future economic growth, began to move higher. But I'd like to contrast something. During this period of time, money base, which is the coarse stuff that ultimately gets processed into money supply, in the United States has grown 600% as a consequence of aggressive action undertaken by the Fed. During the same period of time, money base in Europe has increased 30%. 600%, 30%. One of our concerns, as mentioned earlier, is that the United States may be primed to move out of recession sooner than the other developed economies, in large part because they are not undertaking the same degree of policy stimulus, and in part because they'd rather that we bear the expense. The other way in which we will be bearing the expense has to do with the budget deficit. These numbers, by the way, that I'm about to show you, do not include Mr. Obama's proposed changes in budget. These merely reflect the impact of spending priorities and tax priorities to this point at a time of recession. The current forecast for fiscal year 2009, which began last September, is that this nation will have a deficit in excess of $1 trillion. The important way to look at that is as a percentage of GDP, because it's a measure of how much we can afford, right? If I owe you $5, not a big problem. If your 3-year-old niece owes you $5, you may be a little more concerned about it. So we believe that the deficit for the federal government will be between 7 and 8% this year, which, by the way, finally brings us back to where we were during the Reagan administration. We have had a period of time over the last several decades in which budget deficits have grown and grown. There was a 5-year period during the Clinton administration when we ran putative surpluses, but we are now in a significant deficit position. We happen to think that this is the right thing to do. When the economy itself has inadequate demand because corporations aren't spending, because consumers are reducing their spending, and more jobs are being lost, we think that it is appropriate to provide stimulus through government spending. And I'm going to end where I began, and that is talking about the state and local consequences. We believe that the most worrisome thing about government policy in 2009 is not the federal government, but rather what's happening at the state and local level. The federal government, as we all know, can run deficits for years and years. State and local governments cannot. They need to balance their budgets within a 1-year budget cycle, and as a consequence, there are decisions being made around the country as we speak in terms of tax increases and spending reductions, and the fear is that those spending reductions in particular will dramatically reduce employment further. One of the important elements of the Obama plan is to provide funding to state and local governments for unemployment insurance, for Medicaid spending, and so on, so that the state and local governments don't need to divert from their ongoing spending on infrastructure, their ongoing provision of basic security and safety services to fund those other requirements. And that is one of the reasons that the new federal plan is aimed at offsetting potential declines in unemployment, and we think that that is indeed critical. One of the things that makes a cycle more cyclical and more dangerous, of course, is job losses, and that is something that we think, I hate to use the pun, but we think that that should be job one in terms of what we're aiming to do in terms of policy. And with that, I'm going to stop. I believe we do have, no, we don't have time for questions. Sorry. You can send them to me telepathically.
That was wonderful.
Okay, thank you.
And you're right on time.